The late afternoon sun slanted through the towering glass walls of Alexander Morgan's penthouse office, painting long amber streaks across polished mahogany and cold steel. The city below Manhattan in its chaotic brilliance glittered with life, unaware that in a room far above it, a man who had everything was just told he was running out of time. Alexander sat perfectly still in the leather chair behind his desk, the kind custom built in Italy and delivered by private freight. In front of him, a slim manila envelope rested like a coffin lid on the pristine surface. It had arrived with little fanfare, handed to him by his private physician, who had offered a few sterile condolences before disappearing into the elevator with eyes that couldn't meet his. He didn't need to open it. The words had already been said. 3 months, he whispered, testing the shape of the phrase as if saying it aloud might make it more real or less. Pancreatic cancer, advanced, inoperable, his empire, the culmination of 4 decades of ruthless ambition, was scattered around the world. Morgan investments, real estate holdings, media acquisitions, patents, stocks, buildings in Dubai, Sao Paulo, Tokyo bore his name in towering letters. His net worth was enough to destabilize currencies. None of it could buy him time. He leaned forward with effort, unfastened the gold cufflinks at his wrists, and loosened his silk tie. Every motion felt mechanical, like the twitch of a machine that had outlived its purpose. His hand reached for the crystal decanter beside the window. The scotch inside 30 years aged, a bottle he'd reserved for the day he'd finally retire, poured into the glass like molasses. He took a sip. It tasted like ash. Silence swelled in the room like a tide. No boardroom chatter. No assistants buzzing through Bluetooth earpieces. Just the sound of his own shallow breath. And the city below, oblivious. His gaze drifted to the massive painting behind his desk, a brutal abstract by a famed minimalist artist. Something cold and sharp, just like him. He bought it not because he liked it, but because it made other CEOs uncomfortable. He smirked bitterly. That was the legacy he had built. Power, intimidation, efficiency, not love, not laughter, not a family. The thought slipped into his mind, like an intruder. He hadn't thought about it in years. A flicker. Suddenly, he was 8 again. A small, trembling boy clutching a worn duffel bag in front of a red brick building in Queens. The orphanage had smelled like bleach and boiled cabbage. The woman at the front desk had patted his head without looking at him, calling him sweetheart. In a distracted tone, his mother hadn't come back. He'd waited weeks before he stopped believing she would. He blinked the memory away with a forceful sip of scotch, but it lingered, unwanted. For the first time in decades, Alexander Morgan didn't want to build something. He wanted to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. Not his shareholders, not his board, someone real. He rose slowly and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city pulsed like a living organism, brutal, beautiful, and full of forgotten souls. Boys like he had once been. He didn't plan it. It came to him as naturally as a breath. He would adopt them, not just 1 or 2, but 5 boys, street kids. The ones no one wanted. No PR stunt, no business angle, no tax benefit. Just 5 chances to do something right before the lights went out. He turned from the window, and for the first time in a long while, his reflection in the glass didn't look invincible. It looked human, flawed, frightened, and free. Alexander Morgan picked up his phone. "Give me a list," he said to his assistant. "Boys, homeless, under 15. I don't care what it takes. Just find them." There was a long silence on the other end. "Sir, you heard me," he said, voice steady now. "5 of them. I don't have much time." He hung up before she could respond. Then he sat down again, staring at the unopened envelope. He didn't need to read it. He was already rewriting it. The storm rolled in just as Alexander's black Bentley slid into the alleyway, its sleek body an alien shape in a neighborhood that hadn't seen clean asphalt in years. Rain slashed down in gray sheets, bouncing off rusted fire escapes and leaking gutters. The city here didn't gleam like it did from the penthouse. It growled, scraped, and hid its children in shadows. He stepped out alone, a man in a $1,000 trench coat with shoes that cost more than what most families earned in a month. A man with cancer silently devouring his insides. A man searching for something he couldn't name. His assistant had begged him not to come here. "Let us coordinate this, sir. It's dangerous. These aren't adoption-ready kids, they're feral. They'll rob you, maybe worse, but Alexander insisted. He didn't want sanitized case files and staged interviews. He wanted them, the ones nobody picked, the ones who didn't wear matching sweaters and charity calendars, the forgotten. A crash echoed through the alley, a dumpster tipping over. He turned sharply. Then he saw them, 5 boys, soaked to the skin, crouched like animals behind a broken fence, eyes wild and cornered. They looked like a pack. One of them held a rusted pipe. Another had a cracked backpack clutched to his chest like treasure. Their clothes were shredded hand-me-downs. Their faces were smeared with grime, but behind the dirt were stories, millions of them. Benji, the eldest, stepped forward first. 13, tall for his age, eyes hard like flint. He didn't ask questions. "What do you want, old man?" The others flinched. Clearly, he was the leader. Alexander looked him squarely in the eye. "You." There was a pause. Then Diego, 11, darted forward and shoved Alexander back a step. "Is this a joke? You come here to feel better about yourself, rich man." Jamal, 9, spoke softly. "He's not like the others." "Shut up, genius," Benji snapped. But his eyes didn't leave Alexander's single quotes as style. Liam, only 7, was trembling more from cold than fear. He reached for Tyrese's hand. Tyrese, 10, said nothing but held him tightly. Alexander slowly reached into his coat. 5 cards, each with his contact, each laminated, wrapped in plastic. WATERPROOFED. He extended them. "I'm not here for a photo op. I'm not here for charity. I'm dying," he said bluntly. "I've got 3 months, and I don't want to spend what's left building skyscrapers. I want to spend it giving someone what I never had." Benji spit at the ground. "You think we're your second chance?" Alexander didn't blink. "No, you're mine." Thunder cracked above them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jamal stepped forward, took one card, and stared at it, like it might catch fire. Liam followed, curious. Diego held back, arms crossed, scowling. Tyrese took his silently. Benji snatched his last, never breaking eye contact. They vanished back into the maze of the alley, cards in hand. Alexander didn't follow. He didn't have to. He knew where they'd go. By morning, the city erupted. Headlines screamed from every corner of the internet. Billionaire with terminal cancer plans to adopt 5 homeless boys. Has the world gone mad? Heartwarming or insane? Dying mogul makes shocking final move. Morgan's madness. Adoption or attempted redemption. Bored. Members called emergency meetings. Friends ghosted him. Charities offered to mediate his choice. Psychologists were dragged on OTV panels to debate his mental state. But Alexander wasn't watching. He was busy preparing 5 bedrooms. He walked the hallways of his penthouse and had the art removed from the walls to sterile. He told the designer, put up chalkboards and maps and shelves for comic books. He had the floors carpeted for bare feet, a reading nook built by the windows. He sat at the edge of a bed. Liam's. He decided and stared at a Lego set in his hands. His assistant entered, pale. "They've agreed to come." Alexander smiled. For the first time. It wasn't rehearsed. "Good," he said. "Let's meet the wolves." And somewhere deep inside him, that forgotten 8-year-old boy, the one who waited in vain for someone to come back, felt a door unlock. Wolves in the penthouse of black SUV doors swung open like the gates to another world. And the 5 boys stared up at the skyscraper with expressions that were equal parts awe and suspicion. 52 stories of glass and steel loomed over them, like a monument to something they had never believed in: wealth, safety, permanence. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors reflected the enormous chandelier above, and security guards stiffened at the sight of the ragged group crossing the threshold. Diego looked ready to bolt. Benji's fists were clenched, his body tense like a spring. Jamal whispered something about not touching anything, while Tyrese kept one hand on Liam, who gripped a stuffed rabbit so tattered it looked like a relic from another century. Alexander stood waiting near the private elevator. No press, no cameras, no smiles. He didn't reach out to shake their hands. He didn't kneel or offer gifts. He simply nodded and said, "Come in." Benji narrowed his eyes. "That's it." Alexander met his glare. "What did you expect? A parade? Wouldn't be the weirdest thing," Jamal muttered. The elevator ride was long and silent, the air thick with tension and disbelief. Liam watched the numbers climb, his eyes wide. When the doors finally opened onto the top floor, they stepped into a space that looked more like a museum than a home. Cold, clean, quiet. Then chaos erupted. Diego tested the couch by body slamming it. Jamal found the remote and turned the 90-inch TV to full volume. Liam ran barefoot on the marble, laughing as the echo of his footsteps followed him. Tyrese stood still, but stared at the giant aquarium wall like it was magic. And Benji walked over to a sculpture in the corner, a twisted modern piece that looked like molten glass frozen midair, and shoved it. It shattered into 100 pieces across the floor. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Alexander didn't flinch. Feel better? He asked. Benji stared at him, defiant. You're rich. You'll buy another one. No, Alexander said. That one belonged to someone I hated. I was looking for an excuse to get rid of it. For the first time, Benji looked unsure. A woman entered, late 60s, iron gray bun, posture like a ruler. Miss Hargrove, former headmistress, hired to maintain order in what Alexander called a rapidly shifting power dynamic. The boys bristled at her presence, until she handed Liam a cookie without a word and told Jamal where to find the kitchen. She was strict, but she saw through them like glass. The first night was a war zone. Liam had night terrors and crawled into Alexander's room. He didn't send him away. Diego punched a wall after a nightmare and was shocked when Alexander showed him how to wrap his hand instead of yelling. Benji stayed awake, watching Alexander sleep through the crack in his door like a guard dog to. Wounded to trust the house he'd just been let into. By the third day, the penthouse had changed. Markers were scattered across the once pristine coffee table. Crumbs littered the floor. One of Alexander's suits was covered in spaghetti sauce thanks to Tyrese and an experiment. And the silence, it was gone. Laughter echoed through the hallways, shouting, music, footsteps, life. One evening, Tyrese approached Alexander with a folded paper. He didn't speak, just handed it over. It was a drawing, a man in a suit, crying, surrounded by 5 boys. Above the picture, in shaky block letters, were the words, "The Sad King and His Wolves." Alexander stared at it for a long time. Then he framed it and hung it where the sculpture had once stood. Ms. Hargrove entered the study late that night to find him sitting in silence. "They're wild," she said, "but not lost." He nodded. "Neither am I." But not everyone shared their peace. Down below, in the boardrooms of Morgan Investments, whispers had become roars. His empire was in panic. Stocks had dipped. Reporters camped outside. Business partners withdrew. What CEO takes in 5 homeless children while dying? What man leaves a legacy of billions to strangers? The media called it a breakdown, a slow-motion train wreck, but Alexander knew what it really was. It was a rebirth. And upstairs, while the city speculated and stock prices wavered, 5 boys were curled up in new beds, in rooms designed for each of them, not by decorators, but by Alexander himself. And in the quietest hours of the night, when even the city seemed to sleep, Alexander opened the notebook beside his bed and began writing. 5 letters. One for each boy. Each beginning with the same line. "If you're reading this, I've gone." Winter came early that year. A bitter wind swept down Fifth Avenue, rattling trees dressed in fairy lights, and dusting the glass of Alexander Morgan's penthouse in snow. From 50 stories above the city, the world looked like a snow globe, still and glittering. Inside, however, the penthouse was alive, louder than ever. And for the first time since it had been built, it felt like a home. Alexander sat in the corner of the sprawling living room, pretending to read the Financial Times, while secretly watching his boys fight over who got to hang the last ornament on the 10-foot Christmas tree. The tree wasn't his idea. Liam insisted they needed one. Not wanted, needed. Pop said we could all decorate it, Liam declared, holding the last ornament like a holy relic. Diego snatched it. "Yeah, but you already put, like, 5 up, because you threw your ornaments at Jamal. That was a game." Alexander lowered the newspaper and cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, if one more decoration flies through the air, I'm taking all of you ice skating." The room fell silent. "No," Jamal whispered in mock horror. "Not that again." Alexander smirked. The ice skating incident had nearly resulted in a sprained ankle, a lost shoe, and the teenage boys learning the hard way that balance couldn't be bought. But he had laughed that day, genuinely, loudly. It had scared them at first. Now, it was part of their rhythm. What none of them said aloud, what hung in the air like the frost curling on the windows, was that this might be their last Christmas together. Alexander's condition was worsening. The headaches were more frequent. the fatigue, impossible to ignore. He still attended board meetings via video call, still pretended to be the same titan of industry, but his body told a different truth. Every time he stood too quickly or coughed too hard. He had 3 months. They said diet had been 7 weeks. And now, with the tree glowing in the corner and the smell of gingerbread wafting from the kitchen courtesy of Miss Hargrove's newly discovered baking rage therapy, Alexander made a decision. This Christmas, he would give them everything. He never had Dot at midnight. He called them all to the den. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, a real one, not a digital screen. The boys sat on the rug in pajamas, each holding a mug of cocoa, eyes expectant. "Okay, old man," Benji said, arms crossed. "You made us turn off Die Hard. This better be good." Alexander stood beside 5 carefully wrapped packages on the mantel. No ribbons, no cards, just names. He handed them out one by one. Inside each package, a custom-made adoption certificate, legally binding, official, sealed. They were no longer foster children under the care of a dying billionaire. They were his sons. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Jamal, the quiet one, looked up, blinking rapidly. "Is this real?" "Yes," Alexander said. "I made it official last week." Benji's hands trembled. He threw the paper down. "You're dying," he growled. "Why would you do this? You're gonna leave us anyway." "I might," Alexander admitted, "but I'd rather give you a name and a home today than die knowing I never tried." "You can't just fix everything with paper," Diego said, voice cracking. "I'm not trying to fix you," Alexander replied. "I'm trying to belong to you before it's too late." It was Liam who broke the silence. He stood, walked over, and wrapped his arms around Alexander's waist. "Thanks, Pop." Alexander froze, then knelt, hugging him back tightly. One by one, the others followed. Even Benji, after a long, tense pause, stepped forward, not for a hug, but to hand Alexander something wrapped in newspaper. "Here," he muttered. "We all chipped." And Alexander opened it slowly. Inside was a wristwatch, an old one, worn, cheap, scratched. But inside the back plate was an engraving, carved by hand. "Time doesn't matter. You showed up." The wolves, he held it to his chest like it was worth more than every building. He owned Dot. None of them saw him wipe his eyes. Later that night, while the boys dozed on the couches, tangled in blankets and candy wrappers, Miss Hargrove entered quietly with a glass of water. She paused beside him. "You made the right choice," she said. "I don't know how much time I have," he admitted. She smiled sadly. "None of us do." He looked around the room, at the tree, at the flickering firelight, at 5 boys he never expected to love Dot, and for the first time since the envelope arrived with his diagnosis, Alexander Morgan didn't feel like he was dying. He felt reborn. Somewhere in the study, a file lay sealed on his desk. The boys didn't know it yet, but the contents of that folder would one day change everything. A second opinion, a new scan, a shadow of hope. But for now, there were only the sounds of sleeping boys, a fire crackling in the hearth, and a man who had found his purpose just in time. Snow still clung to the streets below, stubborn in the face of early spring sunshine. The penthouse, once alive with Christmas joy, had shifted, not gone quiet but changed. The laughter was softer now. The boys still argued over remote controls and cereal boxes, but they had started glancing sideways at Alexander. He was slipping. It began suddenly. Missed appointments, eyes closed along in the middle of conversations. A book open on his lap. He hadn't turned a page of in hours. Then, one morning, he collapsed in the hallway. Jamal was the one who found him face down, breath shallow, skin cold. He didn't scream. He just knelt beside Alexander, shaking his shoulder gently, like trying not to wake a sleeping bear. But when there was no response, he ran. The hospital was a blur. White walls, blue scrubs, words that didn't make sense. Benji nearly broke the vending machine. Liam cried in Tyrus's lap, his rabbit clutched so hard his ear tore off. Miss Hargrove paced the waiting room like a ghost. Diego cursed everyone, especially himself. Alexander survived the night, but the doctor's face when she came out said what no one else would. The cancer was winning, fast. The treatment he'd been on had stopped working. There was nothing more they could do except make him comfortable when he returned home. He was in a wheelchair. That night, the penthouse was too quiet. Alexander sat in his study, wrapped in a wool blanket, staring out the window at the skyline he used to own. I thought I had more time, he murmured. Ms. Hargrove placed a cup of tea beside him. You've had more than most, but not enough to teach them everything. She looked at him, her face softening. You already have. He shook his head. Not yet. Over the next week, Alexander transformed his home again, not with art or luxury, but with something far rarer. Each day, he spent one-on-one moments with the boys. He taught Jamal how to tie a real Windsor knot. They both laughed when the knot ended up choking Jamal slightly, but he beamed when he finally nailed it. He taught Diego how to drive in the underground garage. They scraped a column, but Diego smiled wider than he ever had. He let Tyrese paint a mural on the hallway wall. No rules, just color and chaos. It became a storm of reds and blues, raw and beautiful. With Liam, he built a rocket model. Do you think heaven's past the stars? Liam asked one night, blinking sleepily. Maybe, Alexander said, holding him close. But if it is, I'll leave a light on. Benji was the hardest. He didn't want time. He wanted a guarantee. You said we were yours, Benji whispered one night. Now you're leaving us too. I didn't plan to, Alexander replied. No one ever does, Benji snapped. They didn't speak for 2 days after that. Then one morning, Benji left a note on Alexander's nightstand. It said, if you go, who do I become? Alexander stared at it for hours before writing back. You become the man I wish I had met when I was your age. He left it folded on Benji's pillow. That night, Benji crawled into the room and fell asleep in the chair beside him. But the city outside wasn't sleeping. Reporters were back. Questions rose like steam from the streets. What would happen to the Morgan estate? Who were these boys legally, financially, socially? Why hadn't the will been made public? Speculation turned dark. Tabloids whispered about manipulation, greedy foster kids. An old man too sick to see he was being used. One night, Alexander turned off the TV in silence. I don't care what they think, Diego said beside him. They're just scared, Alexander replied. They've never seen a man die loving what he never thought he could have. The next morning, Ms. Hargrove handed him a letter from a private clinic, a second opinion he had requested before Christmas. The envelope was sealed. He placed it on the edge of his desk, untouched, like a loaded gun. He didn't read it. Not yet, because part of him wasn't sure if knowing the truth would help or ruin everything. He had one last thing to do first. He called his lawyer, had his will amended, not for the empire, for the boys. Each of them would receive not just money, but purpose, scholarships, funds to build what they dreamed of, businesses in their names, a foundation called the Wolves of 52nd to support foster kids like them. He signed the documents with a hand that trembled. And in the quiet of the study, he finally whispered what he hadn't dared say since the day the diagnosis was handed to him. I'm not afraid to die. Then he glanced at the sealed envelope one more time and smiled, because tomorrow he would open it, and one way or another, fate would have to speak. Rain fell like mourning fingers against the windows of the cathedral. Inside, the towering hall stood cloaked in solemn darkness, its Gothic arches echoing with the low murmur of a city trying to make sense of its greatest mystery, the death of Alexander Morgan. The casket sat beneath a mountain of white roses, cold and polished like everything else he'd touched in life. Photos stood on easels, portraits of Alexander from boardrooms and business galas, magazine covers, handshake deals. Not a single image showed him smiling. Not one included the 5 boys who now stood silently in the front row, dressed in black, suits they didn't ask for, too young to be this familiar with death, and too old to believe it could be this unfair. Liam clutched Tyrese's hand, trembling. Diego stood with a jaw so tight it looked carved from stone. Jamal didn't blink once. Benji stared at the casket like it owed him answers, and Alexander wasn't there. At least, not in the way anyone expected. The official story was clear. Complications from cancer, peaceful, dignified, private. The funeral was a media circus dressed in black. Cameras stayed just far enough back to respect the mourning, but lenses zoomed in on every expression. Tragic, whispered one mourner. Madness, muttered another. They said he left everything to those boys, hissed a woman behind. A designer veil, all of it. No trustees, no foundation boards, just them, the lawyer. A tired man named Sullivan stood by the altar, gripping the sealed envelope, the last will and testament of Alexander Morgan. When he stepped forward, 2. Speak. The murmur ceased. In accordance with Mr. Morgan's final wishes, Sullivan began. There will be no eulogy today. No grand speeches, just a note, written by Alexander himself. He unfolded a letter and read, voice steady, to those gathered, I spent my life building walls, towers of steel and marble to protect myself from the world and from my own past. And then, 5 boys tore those walls down in 3 months, not with weapons, not with threats, but with the kind of honesty only the abandoned can give. I'm not leaving you a legacy of money. That part will take care of itself. I'm leaving you something rarer, a choice. Build something, not towers, not banks. Build people, build homes, build yourselves. I'll see you again someday when the city lights go out. The words struck like thunder. Benji turned away sharply, fists clenched. Jamal's shoulders shook. Liam began to cry, but not the sobs of a child. The silent, broken sound of someone who had belonged for a moment and then lost it again. After the service, the penthouse felt like a mausoleum. All the noise was gone. The lights dimmed early. Dishes went unwashed. Miss Hargrove walked softer. Even the fish in the wall-length aquarium seemed to drift more slowly, mourning in silence. A week passed. Then another. One morning, a thick envelope arrived in the courier's hand, marked with Alexander's handwriting. To my sons, read this together inside. 5 letters. And a video drive. The boys gathered in the den, hearts pounding. Benji slid the USB into the projector. The screen flickered to life. Alexander sat in his study, wearing a cardigan and his old glasses. His voice was weaker, but his eyes burned with clarity. If you're watching this, I'm gone, or so you think. But first, before anything else, I need you to understand something. I didn't adopt you to save you. You saved me. Every wall, every silence, every cold morning I ever endured. You cracked it open with your chaos, and I was grateful. But I couldn't leave you in a world that would only remember me as the man who made billions. So I gave them what they wanted, a death, a clean end. But I also left behind a trail, one you'll have to follow if you want the truth. The screen cut to black. The boys stared in stunned silence. Benji stood first. He's not dead. What do you mean? Liam whispered. He faked it, Jamal said, eyes wide. The envelope, the skin he never opened. It must have said something else. Miss Hargrove entered slowly, her expression unreadable. There's a cabin, she said softly, upstate. No phones, no signal. It's under a trust in another name. He told me to wait 10 days. If you still believed in him, I was to take you there. Is he alive? Diego asked, voice sharp. Ms. Hargrove didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and handed Benji a set of keys. There was a tag on the ring. It read, home is not where you're born. It's where you're found. The boys packed in silence that night. They didn't know what they'd find at the end of the road, a ghost, a goodbye, or a second chance. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the truth. The road to the cabin was narrow and coiled like a snake through the mountains. Pines lined the edge like silent sentinels, and mist curled low across the windshield as Miss Hargrove drove in silence. The boys were quiet too, each of them carrying their own storm of thoughts, memories, and questions no one dared to ask out loud. Benji held the key in his hand like it was sacred. It had been 12 days since Alexander Morgan's funeral. And now, they were driving into the unknown. The car stopped in front of a simple wooden gate. Beyond it stood a modest cabin with ivy climbing the corners and smoke trailing faintly from the chimney. Liam gripped Jamal's sleeve. There's smoke. Someone's inside. Benji stepped out first. His legs trembled, but not from cold. They walked up the gravel path together, shoulder to shoulder. Like they had the first day they entered Alexander's penthouse. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. A fire crackled. A pot simmered gently on the stove. Boots lay near the door. A coat hung on the rack, but no sign of Alexander. Only a note, resting under a single teacup on the kitchen table. Upstairs, one at a time, the room fell into thick silence. Benji was the first to move. He climbed the stairs slowly, every step an echo in the stillness. The others waited below, breathless. At the top, he found a single room, sunlight leaking through linen curtains, and there sitting in a rocking chair by the window, wrapped in a heavy knit blanket, was Alexander Morgan. Older, thinner, but alive. He looked up. Their eyes met. Hello, Benji, Alexander whispered. Benji didn't speak. He walked forward, eyes full, fists clenched, and then, without a word, he knelt beside the chair and buried his head in Alexander's lap. I thought you left, he finally said. I thought we lost you. I had to let the world believe that, Alexander replied, his hand gently resting on Benji's head. But I never left you, not once. One by one, the others came up. Diego hugged him tighter than he'd ever hugged anyone. Jamal just stood there, tears streaming silently. Liam crawled into his lap like a child again. Tyrese gave him a picture he'd drawn of the penthouse and the cabin, side by side labeled before and home. That evening, the fire glowed long into the night as Alexander told them the truth. The letter he never opened. He finally had died. It wasn't a death sentence. The second opinion had shown something the first hadn't. A rare mutation, treatable. With aggressive therapy and time, he could survive. But the time he'd been given, and how he'd used it, it couldn't be undone. So he made a choice. Let the world believe he had died. Let the vultures scatter. Let the name Alexander Morgan become legend. While he became something new. He became a father. I didn't want to go back, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Not to boardrooms, not to deals. I wanted to disappear into something real. And you five, you're the only real thing I've ever had. Benji finally asked the question that all feared. Are you still sick? Alexander smiled. Not today. And that was enough. Weeks passed. They stayed in the cabin, just the six of them. They cooked. They played. They built a shed together, argued over how to split chores, and talked late into the night. The money, it was still there waiting, silent, untouched in trust. But for once, no one cared. Until one morning, news broke. A leaked file, a scandal. In Morgan Investments, executives had begun carving up the empire like vultures. Misused funds, a potential collapse. It was the very thing Alexander had feared. The legacy he left behind was rotting, but instead of returning with vengeance, he made another choice. He called his lawyer, and then he called his sons. The next week, the world was stunned when a press conference was held not by a board, not by attorneys, but by the 5 adopted sons of Alexander Morgan. They stood tall, side by side, with Benji at the microphone. My father built a kingdom, he said, and before he left it, he taught us one thing. You don't rule by power, you rule by purpose. They announced the launch of the Wolves Foundation, repurposing Morgan Investments into a non-profit venture focusing on education, housing, and mental health care for orphans, street kids, and foster youth across the country. No longer an empire of cold capital. It became an empire of second chances. And Alexander, he watched it all unfold from the cabin, proud, quiet, smiling. When the first headquarters opened in Harlem, they named the building after him, not Morgan Tower, but the house that chose us. And in the lobby, beneath a photo of 6 people sitting around a firelit cabin, the plaque read, in memory of the man the world thought had everything, until he found what mattered most, and chose love over legacy.